Okay, so now that we've covered a lot of the conceptual material of the class, sedimentary rocks and how they tell time, the Earth being dynamic through plate tectonics, life being dynamic through organic evolution, we can finally begin our trip through time from the beginning. And before we get to what I consider really good fossils of the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic, there is this huge section of time before that. Collectively, it's called the Precambrian, but it's divided into two separate groups, the Archean and the Proterozoic, and actually one before that. So, to start with, there is something called the Hadean era. So, from about 4.9 billion years ago, that's how old we think the Earth is, to about 4.6 billion years old, where we have the oldest rocks. Look at that. There's 0.3 billion years old, or 300 million years, where the Earth was around, but we don't have any record of it. And so it's like Hades. It's like this underworld, this Ur place. And so we call that the Hadean era. If we were to find a rock tomorrow that is 4.7 billion, then the Hadean would be shortened by that much. So that's it. If you look at that picture, there's an image of this early Earth, a hot ball in space, which is slowly but surely getting bigger as all of these other little planetesimals, all this junk, this rocky junk in space, is pulled towards this larger gravity attractive object, the proto-Earth. At some point, though, the Earth assembles, it cools down, and we start preserving rocks. The oldest rocks being about 4.6 billion years old, found in Australia, although people are certainly looking all over the globe for even older ones. And we call this the Archean. It means the oldest rocks, oldest time. And from 4.6 billion to 2.5 billion, that's it. The 2.5 billion is set in stone. We just arbitrarily decided that's going to be the cutoff for it. As I said in the previous slide, the 4.6 billion, that dates to whatever the oldest measured rock is. Well, look at that. This is almost 50% of all geologic time. It's huge, it's huge, it's huge, and yet I'm not going to talk about it in great detail, mostly because we don't have a lot of good, solid data for it. But what we do have is pretty interesting, and it makes this a time of origins. Before I switch to the next slide, I want you to look at this one a little bit more detail, and this gives you a picture of the early Archean Earth. There's land, rocky land, but notice there's nothing on it. There are these little small seaways or oceans, baby oceans. You see some mountains, including an active volcano. And you see by the clouds in the sky that there is some rudimentary atmosphere. So, how do we get all those things? We got to talk about origins. So first of all, origins of the land, origins of the continent. And you've got a few terms to learn and a little equation that kind of relates the two. The craton in brown is the central, most stable part of the continent. It also has a purple area around it. So notice it's not fully North America, but it's most of it. And the craton itself is made up of the shield, the brown part, and then also the platform, the purple part. The brown part is deformed igneous metamorphic rocks, the earliest first formed rocks, and then we already talked about weathering. Any rock that is sticking up in some type of atmosphere is going to be weathered, and so you're going to deposit this rim of purple, this deformed sedimentary rocks around there. Those two together act as the nucleus for the continents, and they have grown through time. Notice particularly for the west coast of North America, it's called an accretionary belt. And remember from last week we talked about the accreted terrains, exotic terrains, whatever you want to call them, being slowly added to the different continents and making them grow through time. And that's what the green part is showing there. Well, besides the origins of the continents, we also we have the atmosphere. So today we're breathing an atmosphere that is about 21% oxygen, 73% or so nitrogen, and then a whole bunch of other things, including carbon dioxide, etc. Where did it all come from? Well, ultimately it comes from being made in stars, but where did it come from? Let's set it. Where did it come from in the Earth? It came from the outgassing of volcanoes. If we look at volcanoes today, like the one in the cartoon here, you see that there is carbon dioxide and hydrogen and nitrogen and carbon monoxide and sulfur, etc. All of those things are being belched out of volcanoes today. The one thing you notice is that there's not free oxygen. There's no free O2, which we need to live and which a lot of living forms on planet Earth need to live. Therefore, we have an origin of an atmosphere which is very different than today, and so we need to have some mechanisms to increase the amount of oxygen through time. Well, this can be done several ways, but first of all, let me talk about how we know the oxygen, or how we confirm that this early atmosphere had not much oxygen. It's mainly because we look at rocks, and when we look at early Archean rocks, they are rich in fool's gold, pyrite. It is the chemical symbol of that compound is FeS2, or iron sulfide, and if it exists anywhere where there's lots of oxygen, it rusts away. The fact that we have it in so many early Archean rocks means that that time period did not have a lot of free oxygen. So you've got a couple ways to get it. One way is way up in the upper atmosphere. We have the sun just blasting us with ultraviolet radiation. We see that we have volcanoes spewing out water vapor, H2O, and that splits that molecule and makes some free oxygen. But no matter how much we model it, it doesn't quite make enough. How we get enough is from plants. As soon as we evolve plants on planet Earth, what do? They photosynthesize. They ingest carbon dioxide, and one of their resulting products, waste products if you will, is oxygen, O2. And once we get plants, that takes us to our oxygen-rich atmosphere. What else about the Earth? Well, the Earth is also, it's a water planet. 3/4 of it is covered by water. Where did that come from? Well, that escaping steam, that hydrogen and oxygen water vapor that's coming out of volcanoes, comes out of a very hot area, and then suddenly it's in a very cool condition. So it condenses, just like the liquid drops condense on a glass of soda if you're drinking it, an ice water drink, and precipitates and comes down and accumulates. And by the early Archean, we know that we have several oceans, small oceans. And how do we tell? By the existence of facies. Don't forget those. Remember the sort of trend of environments and rocks away from the shoreline to the deep? Well, we've got them by the Archean. We don't know how really big these oceans were, but we can definitely say we have them. And finally, what big origin happens in the Archean period or era is that we originate life. In the crudest sense, life just has to be something that reproduces itself and metabolizes, eats, ingests things. On planet Earth, all life that we know of is made of the big four. We call it CHAN, which stands for carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. Incidentally, notice that those four things are among the elements that are being spewed out of volcanoes as carbon dioxide, hydrogen, H2, water vapor, H2O, carbon monoxide, CO, nitrogen, N2, and a whole bunch of other things. But that's the big four. And so if we were to imagine an ancient Earth with a rudimentary atmosphere and lots of these molecules being spewed out, could we model this and somehow see what we can get? And ever since the 1930s and into the 40s, we've done this. Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, famous geologists, you don't have to remember their names. They created this lab apparatus that you see here. They have an ancient ocean, which they periodically heat. The heated water will activate some of these molecules to have a state change, become water vapor, create an ancient atmosphere, and then to stimulate or simulate ancient lightning, they just have some sparker there. So you've got an atmosphere with these molecules. They're sparked, and then you have them cooling again, just like the stuff spewing out of a volcano, which then trends back to our ancient ocean. And it turns out that if you take these ingredients at the top, and remember, these are things coming out of volcanoes: hydrogen gas, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, water, ammonia, NH4, methane, CH4. The result is that you produce these things down at the bottom. And these are the very primitive, simplest of organic molecules. These are amino acids: glycine, sarcosine, alanine, etc., etc. And this is the start of creating life. Now, we've done this in the lab. We have created even more elaborate setups, and we've created bigger molecules, not just monomers like these, but polymers, but we haven't yet gotten them to reproduce or metabolize themselves. So we're not creating life in the laboratory. We're creating or recreating these early conditions that make these early molecules that definitely are precursors to life, but no one's made life. There are a couple labs in Russia that are still attempting this, but really we're just trying to model what might have happened there. Then we need one more thing. If you have all of those loose molecules like that, you need some method to concentrate them, to group them, to put large amounts of them together so that further bonding can take place, to build these bigger molecules and again, ultimately, life. And so we don't know, but one of the best hypotheses still is that this probably happened at some kind of ancient shoreline, like the one shown in the picture. Here's another picture of the Archean. Here's the land at the bottom. You've got the ocean. You see the waves coming in. There's some of those giant volcanoes, and there's that early atmosphere. Well, think about it. If you've got an ocean with those amino acids, those organic molecules, where is the place where they're constantly concentrated? And that's the shore. The shore. The waves are coming in 24/7, 365. And if you've ever been to a beach, you notice that when these waves crash, they create all kinds of frothy bubbles in the surf zone. And if you were to sample those today, those bubbles have lots of amino acids on them. And so we think that this is a place where this starts being concentrated. And if you look at this painting here, I really like this one. Look at these weird little pods that are right there at the near shore area. These things are the artist's representation of what we feel, or what we know, what the evidence says is the first evidence of life on planet Earth. The Archean fossils, the oldest fossils we know, are these things that we call stromatolites. All they are mats of algae that are cemented together. Now today we can go to only a couple places where they still have these, mostly because if these start building up today, we have a world of creatures that want to eat that and eat them down, grind them down to nothing. Think about snails gobbling up algae in your aquarium. Where these mats of algae grew or grow today, they're gobbled up. In the past, before those things were invented that ate them, they just grew, and they grew into these big structures. And so the lower picture here, you can sort of see these black pods in the blue water. That's an actual photograph of Shark's Bay in Australia. And it's such a salty bay. It's sort of an enclosed bay. It's so salty that it prevents things like snails and other grazers from living there. And so these stromatolites today in that place don't get eaten down. They grow, and they mimic what we saw in the ancient fossil record like this. If you take one out and saw it in half, as they've done here, you see the layering effect on this. And so what happens, how these grow today, if you sort of zoom it in here, there's the algae growing. You have this sticky green algae, sort of shown here. It might be ciliated, it might not. But if sediment gets washed in, which are the little brown chunks, those are little clasts, it sticks to it. It doesn't fully kill this algae, it then makes a base and the algae grows through it to make another layer that's out there that collects the next layer of sediment. And if you're in a place like the shoreline where the tide comes in and the tide goes out, the water goes in and the water goes out, and the clasts it's carrying goes in and goes out, then you're going to build up layer after layer after layer into these domed structures like this. The oldest Archean stromatolites, they're not as old as the oldest rocks, and this is a picture of one. Sorry there's no scale. This is about as big as a grapefruit, but you can see they've sawed it in half or broken it in half, and you can see the layering on this. And if you were to take a small cut of this and enlarge it in the microscope, there's actually microscopic algae fossils in this. This is a stromatolite, and these things become global in the Archean oceans. They are everywhere in the Archean oceans. But they're the first evidence, the first fossil life you can put your hand on and say, this is evidence of life. But there must have been something else. So if you look at stromatolites, well, we think that they were photosynthesizing algae. Algae like them today photosynthesize, and we can tell also in the Archean that we start getting this more and more oxygen-rich atmosphere, so we think that's what's happening. But if you look at this, those algae that do this, we call them blue-green algae or sometimes cyanobacteria, they are anaerobic, that is, they need to grow or they grow well in oxygen-free environments. They are autotrophic, meaning they produce their own food. So trophism is feeding, and auto means you're self-feeding. And then they are prokaryotic, which I'll show in just a minute. Prokaryotic cells are the simplest cells that exist. It's just simply biologic material enclosed by a cell wall membrane. And so that's what these things are. Anaerobic, little to no oxygen, autotrophic, feeding yourselves, prokaryotic, single cell without a nucleus. Two of these are the simplest forms of existence imaginable, anaerobic and prokaryotic. But autotrophic is pretty advanced. Photosynthesis is a complex process. So we have to imagine some earlier life form that was anaerobic, heterotrophic, and prokaryotic. Now, heterotrophic, well, we're heterotrophic. Heterotrophic means eating something else or an external source of nutrition. And so these earliest cells probably existed in this oxygen-free environment, barely existing as just something, biologic material enclosed by a cell wall, but periodically ingesting other things. We don't have that in the fossil record. People are looking. We don't have it yet. But what we do have, stromatolites, they are everywhere. Well, so for almost half of Earth's history, the Archean, we've had a lot of origins of the continents, origins of the oceans, origins of the atmospheres, origins of life. And it just stays that way for those billions of years until we reach this time that we're going to call the Proterozoic era. Now, the Proterozoic era, its start time is about 500 or 2.5 billion years ago. Remember, that is defined exactly as the end of the Archean and the start of the Proterozoic, after all. That extends to about 540 million years ago. And I have about the little tilde squiggle here because that kind of varies depending on, what our fossil record is in a place, or what we're finding in different spots in the world. Notice this is also a huge chunk of time. This is about 42-43% of all geologic time. Well, what's going on there? So first of all, it's business as usual. All of those things, continents, oceans, keep growing. The atmosphere keeps getting more oxygen rich, and life slowly gets more and more abundant and more complex, as shown in the painting behind here. Look at here. So this isn't just stromatolites. This is a whole bunch of other living things coming along. But really, for most of this Proterozoic era, it's still just single-celled critters until near the end, where we get this blossoming of all this other type of life. So what's going on? First of all, let's talk about the increase of oxygen here. We have evidence for this in the rocks. We know that we have photosynthesizing algae, and about this time we start getting what's called BIF, B-I-F, banded iron formations. And these are the two pictures in the upper part of the slide. There's rock hammer for scaled and a little hand specimen. And you see these sort of tiger-striped rocks with red and then either gray or white or black or whatever. Red is sort of the universal rock color for presence of oxygen. If you think about it, if you've got a rusty old beater car, what color does that iron or your old beat up bumper turn into? It turns into kind of a rusty orange color. That's because the iron in there is bonding with the oxygen in the atmosphere to create new minerals, basically rust, which are red like this. Well, between 2.5 and 2.0 billion years ago, so right at the start, go back here, right at the start of the Proterozoic, we produce 92% of all the BIF we've ever found. This is all over the place. About the nearest place where we can get it to us, it used to be quite common in northern Minnesota. A lot of it's been mined for iron to make steel for our modern industrial society here, but that's where a lot of our BIF happens. It indicates periodic oxygen rich when it's red, then oxygen poor, then oxygen rich, then oxygen poor, oxygen rich, then oxygen poor. How we interpret this is to say that the algae keep photosynthesizing. They generate so much oxygen in the water that it will bond with the iron in the sediment at the bottom of the ocean and turn it red. It uses up all the oxygen. Then deposition keeps going and it deposits layers that aren't affected by or don't have enough oxygen to rust them. Meanwhile, the plants are doing their thing. They recreate an oxygen-rich atmosphere only to have it bond with all the seafloor again over and over and over again. And where these things are found, you can have several thousand feet of this, indicating that this was a common situation. So think about it. You've got oxygen increasing. It makes sense that there'd be this period of transition where it goes from high to low to high to low to high to low to high to low. At some point, though, we reach the point where we produce red beds, pure red beds, like shown in the lower photograph here. Now this, if you could then interpret as oxygen rich all the time. And so after about 1.8 billion years ago, we get continental red beds. So red beds from the land even, to indicate that the atmosphere, not just the ocean waters, are rich in oxygen, so that if there's any iron-rich materials, soils, sediments, igneous rocks, whatever, at the surface, that iron in there is going to bond with the oxygen in the atmosphere to make these red beds. So notice, think about this. We went from pyrite in the Archean to BIF in the early Proterozoic to red beds in the later Proterozoic. Iron poor, transitional iron to iron rich. The rocks give us evidence of this change in the atmosphere. Life highlights, many more things happen, and if I were a different professor, I'd really emphasize this. I have colleagues that their research interests are Proterozoic, and so they'll spend weeks on this stuff, but I want to get through this to the next stage, the Paleozoic. But one of the key things that I can't gloss over in the Proterozoic is that we get more and more prokaryotes of all different kinds, and then we have the origin of the cell type that we call the eukaryotes at about 1.2 billion years old. And the picture below shows the two types of cells. Here's that primitive cell I told you about. Remember, this is just a wall enclosing some biological materials. Compare that to the eukaryotic cell. So first of all, it is much larger. And second of all, it is far more complex. And it has a lot of, not organs, but what we call organelles in there. There's mitochondria, there's all kinds of little things that start serving different functions. And then in particular in the center, notice there is a nucleus. And the genetic material of the cell is sequestered in another sort of ball or central area that is enclosed within another wall, and we call this the nucleus. Here, the prokaryotic cell genetic material is scattered throughout. Here, in this larger cell, with organelles of different functions, you've got a place where this genetic material is sequestered. And this is the rule for the rest of the Proterozoic until we reach this thing that we're going to call snowball Earth. Well, we're coming along, we're cruising through the Proterozoic, and near the end of the Proterozoic, at about 650 to 625 million years ago, something profound happens. We get our first set of ice ages, and we get a doozy of them. We get ice that completely encloses planet Earth. Now, we associate glacial ice today with two places, either the North Polar area or the South Polar area, where so little solar radiation reaches it that it's so cold that it stays frozen up there, or in high mountains, which are so high in the atmosphere that it's perpetually cold that we grow glaciers. And you probably know we have periodic terms in Earth history called ice ages, where the ice grows and covers huge swaths of the land. But we always had the idea that these ice masses, these glacial masses that are huge size, could not grow in the tropics. We simply receive so much solar radiation there, it's too hot. You can't do it. But in the 1980s, we started finally accumulating a lot of evidence from around the globe that said to us, wow, during this time period, even places that we know from tectonics were in the tropics have evidence that glaciers existed there. And so you have to imagine a planet like this that not only has polar ice caps, but growing ice sheets, and ultimately a ball that is completely frozen or mostly frozen. And we've called this the snowball Earth, or SE hypothesis. All right, well, what's our evidence for it? So first of all, if we go to these places that are, well, all around the globe for rocks of this age, and then that would represent places that were tropical originally, were temperate, were all these different things. We find stacks of rocks like this. We have cold water rocks. So glacial deposits, as shown by this sort of stripe in the middle here. And glaciers are very distinctive. When they exist, they leave lots of different pieces of evidence that says, whoa, glacial ice was here. We'll go through a couple of those in just a minute. And then sitting right on top of them, with no evidence of an unconformity, no evidence of a gap, we have warm water rocks. So when it says here cap carbonates, those are things like limestones, which we've already learned indicate warm ocean rocks. So it's as if a switch was flipped from turning on. So cold to hot, cold to hot quickly. So the first question was, well, how did they occur there? How in the world did they occur in the tropical equatorial regions? And then why did they disappear so quickly? Let's look at another place. This is Svalbard. It's a frigid wasteland today. This is far north, northern hemisphere. But again, in the past, it was in the tropics, and this has this rock diamictite, as labeled on the diagram, and that's a glacial rock, and it contains these things called drop stones, which I'll show you in just a minute. And then sitting right on top of it is cap dolomite, carbonates again, warm water. So again, we get this repeated: glacial rocks, warm water, glacial rocks, warm water. And then within these glacial rocks, we find evidence that we call drop stones. So the man standing there is actually Paul Hoffman, one of the originators of this hypothesis, a Harvard professor. And where he's standing, notice that the beds of rock, this brown rock here, has these big giant clasts. So look at these white clasts I'm kind of circling with the cursor here. These are giant boulders that are sitting here in this quiet ocean mud. That shouldn't be there. It shouldn't be there like that. And essentially the only way we know that this happens is when glaciers that have plowed over the land and plucked up all kinds of big rocks move out over the oceans. The bottom of the glacier drops these things out. They fall through the ocean and bloop, they stick themselves in the mud like this. This is why they're called drop stones. They've been dropped out of the bottom of the glacier, and there they are. Well, these drop stones sitting in these glacial rocks, glacial ocean bottom rocks, are found all over the world for this period that we're calling snowball Earth. Here's another picture of some drop stones, and here it's kind of embedded in some biff, some late stage biff, but you see here it's business as usual, fine layers of rocks, and then chunk. This big drop stone here has fallen out of a glacial mass. It's kind of deformed, made a little crater. It'd be like you just throwing a rock into a muddy area. What's left of a pond that's dried up, that's still muddy. You'd throw a rock in there and bloop, it would stick in there and make kind of a hole and a crater, and there it would be. Here's another picture of some drop stones. There's a ballpoint pen for scale. You can see the fine layering of the mud, and then all of these drop stones blooped into it. So these are evidence of glaciers moving out over the oceans, covering ocean basins and dropping these things, and it pretty much indicates that there's a global distribution of these. Here's another really nice picture of this one. I like this one from Africa. I don't know what African coin that is, but you could imagine that's probably about as big as a dime or a nickel, something like that. But you see the fine layering here, and then bloop. This rock was dropped into it. You see it kind of deformed it and made a little crater, and then the next mud just laid over the top like this. So drop stones. If we look at the drop stones themselves then, pull them out, clean them off, we see that they are then covered by scratch marks or striations. And these scratch marks, they occur at the bottom of glaciers as they're grinding over the land. So the glacier is moving. This giant mass of ice is moving on the land. It's picking up all these rocks and boulders and things, and meanwhile it's scratching the heck out of them, incorporating them into the ice. It moves out over the ocean, and then it drops them, bloop, and makes drop stones. So we have drop stones covered with striations. Great evidence that these glaciers existed over the ocean. Well, glaciers existing over the ocean, what's that going to do to the life that is there? This is a picture of a modern ocean. You see some starfishes and things down there, and except for this crack letting this little bit of sun in, you've got ice covering them there. So life can live under here as long as there's enough solar radiation to get through, even photosynthesizing plants can continue on. And if you do happen to have places like little oases in the covering of the earth by this snowball earth where sun still penetrates through, you'll have little refuges like this where life continues on. But something else happens here too. If we look at the timing of this, so this is sort of a weird diagram. The branching red line is sort of an evolutionary tree, life evolving. And the oldest is at the bottom, younger at the top, so it's sort of base steno. The yellow portion is the Proterozoic, and the pink portion on top of it is the Paleozoic, which we're getting to. So we're near the end of the Proterozoic, and we have, here, notice I have made two arrows, SE, snowball Earth. We have two big pulses of this glaciation. Your first thought would be that this should kill life. There should be an extinction event. And yes, there was. But this also acted as an extreme environmental pressure to force natural selection on the life that existed here. And one way to exist in a place like this is no longer to be single-celled, but to form colonies or aggregates or groupings of cells that become multicellular organisms. And if we look at the timing of this, we have these pulses of glaciation. Prior to this, boom, almost all life is single cells. After the last snowball Earth, we suddenly get basically modern life, chordates like us, deuterostomes, echinoderms, arthropods like insects and lobsters and crabs, mollusks like clams and snails, lophotrochozoans, bryozoans, annelid worms. We start to get more modern life right after. So the thought is that the snowball Earth was so profound that it acted as a driver for natural selection to force, or at least push, towards the evolution of multicellular life. And the first evidence of this is what we call the Ediacaran fauna. We go to these rocks right after the last snowball Earth and we find large things. So notice here's a tape measure for scale. You see this thing is several inches long here. You've got others where they are many inches or a couple feet or a meter or more large. They are large, soft bodies found globally. So large, big enough you can see them. They're not single cells. They're huge, many inches, many feet. Soft bodies, how do we know they're soft bodies? Well, there's no real evidence that they are have hard parts. We're not preserving shell or bone or teeth. We're preserving impressions. So if you think about it, if you go to the beach today and walk on it, you leave a set of footprints. You're gone, but there's footprints. There's evidence that you were alive. Think also about walking on the beach. This happened to me many times. You walk on the beach and there's a dead fish or there's a dead jellyfish. And you pry it up, peel it up, and look at it, and that dead jellyfish, that dead fish leaves an impression of their body in the sand. If that were to be preserved in these near-shore environments, you would then create the type of fossils we have from the Ediacaran. So why does it have this weird name, Ediacaran? It comes from the place where they were first found, the Ediacaran Hills. You see there's still giant mountains of Australia. And when we look at the rock, the evidence from the facies, we see that, yes, indeed, these are from beach environments. And they're a whole series of what we call molds and casts, just sort of impressions in the sediment. And there probably were, there's good evidence that they are multicellular creatures. So now just a few pictures of some of them. Here is Dickinsonia. This one's several inches long, but there are some that are a couple feet long. And clearly, this isn't just some random sedimentary class there, and it's clearly not a single-celled thing. It is large, and has a very definite structure. There's a bilateral type structure, there's some radial structures. It was a living creature. Here's Sprigina, and this one is a creature, looks more worm-like, but again, you've got sort of an established head type area, a tail area. There's a bilateral symmetry, meaning the left side is the same as the right side. You've got lots of segments. This is complex. Again, before Snowball Earth, we didn't have anything like this. Snowball Earth happens, and after the Earth warms up, life like this blossoms. This one, Charnia. This one looks like a whole bunch of sort of potential corals or sea pens, sea fronds. Again, the distance here, there's no scale, but this probably has several inches to several feet in size. Tribrachidium, another one here. Here, this thing has a circular radial structure and then divided into threes, and the outer area has all of these little sort of linear type features. Again, you would not say that these things are just sort of random occurrences or sedimentary clasts or cracks in the rock. They're clearly evidence of some type of life. And the thought now is that these things might be the precursors to all later life, but they're still odd and distinct enough on their own so that collectively, let's go back through them, we call them these Ediacaran fauna. They are large, soft-bodied weirdos that existed after Snowball Earth, but before what's going to happen at this Precambrian-Cambrian boundary. And that's what we're going to get to after we reach the Paleozoic. So we're going to have the second test, exam 2, which covers all of these things. Now, besides these lectures, or this lecture that I've given you today on the Archean and the Proterozoic, I've also loaded up 2 different videos for you to look at. One is from the Planet of Life series called The Birth of Earth, which has a lot of sort of interesting parts. It's older, but it has some interesting parts on the origins of actual life. And then the second one is from the Catastrophe series, which is the Snowball Earth story. And it goes into much greater detail on how Snowball Earth started, how long it lasted, and how it ended, and then this sort of flourishing of life afterwards. So you must watch these videos because I'll probably ask at least a couple test questions on them.